Okay, so we're gonna start on Joel today. Joel's one of the shortest, if not the shortest, of the minor prophets. It's only 3 chapters long. Um, and I seem to say this every time we start a new book, Joel is unique. And one of the things that's unique about Joel is we don't really know when he wrote the book. All the rest of the prophets say, during the reign of so and so and so and so and so and so. Joel chapter 1, verse 1 says, the word of the Lord that came to Joel. That's all it says, right? So we don't really know when it was written. We don't really know to whom it was written, although we've got some ideas about both of those. Um, but the thing about Joel is you could probably put Joel anywhere and it would make sense. Okay. Um, he does mention in the book different enemies of Israel. He mentions Tyre, he mentions Sidon, he mentions Philistia, he mentions Edom, he mentions Egypt. It's notable he doesn't mention Assyria or Syria. He doesn't mention Babylon. He doesn't mention Persia. Okay. Um, so if we, the second chart that I gave you, I have him down here. Um, but that's kind of a late date. You could have him all the way down here in no, you couldn't have him any later than that. That's the latest time you could have him right there, I think. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. If you look at the other chart up here, I've got him earlier on this chart up in the time of Joash. But again, he could fit all the way down into Ahaz or the beginning of Hezekiah. So the reason is because who he doesn't mention. That's the main reason for that date. By the time toward the end of the reign of Ahaz, the beginning of Hezekiah reign, Assyria is starting to be a big deal. And he doesn't mention Assyria. And obviously, he didn't mention Babylon or Persia either. So it's pretty much got to be before I think the Assyrian problem starts to come up, crisis A starts to come up. Um, a lot of folks put him at the earlier time I was talking about, up around the time of Joash. That's about, you can't put him any earlier than that, I don't think, but that's probably the earliest. I tend to kind of lean toward the later date, kind of down toward Ahaz, but that's an opinion. We don't know that. Okay. Um, I kind of think he probably is prophesying to Judah, although again, he never says that, but he does talk about things. He talks about the temple, okay, and the temple's in Judah, in Jerusalem. And he says another thing or two that kind of sound like Judah. And so I tend to personally think he is prophesying to Judah. It sounds like um, this, the struggle that Israel and Judah went through as far as being unfaithful to the Lord. It sounds like that's happening, but it doesn't sound like it's full blown. We'll see how this as we go through. So again, that's why I kind of tend to want to put it earlier in that time range. Um, Look at Joel chapter 1, verse 1 says the word of the Lord came to Joel. And again, that's all we have from a historical background. So the things I normally ask you to look at, we really can't look at because we just don't know for sure when he was there. But if you look at verse 2 of chapter 1, he says, hear this, you elders. So again, we've talked before, the prophet is usually addressing the king. Okay, so elders would be the king and the royal court type of thing. And he says, give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. So he's including everybody in this. And he asked a question. It's a rhetorical question, but he asked a question: has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your father? Did your dad and your granddad tell you stories about something like this going on? You know, the Jews are very much a oral history community. They've always been like that. Um, they tell stories around the table, right? And a lot of the scripture that they know from a family setting because they do it at the table. They cite and quote scripture. They tell the stories. Liz and I were laughing at they were something we were watching. They were talking about Esther, and whenever they say the name Haman, everybody goes boo and bangs on the table and stuff. Again, it's just part of that tradition that they do. But we have to stop and say, what is the this? Yeah, he says, has anything like this happened in your days? Okay. Well, that's a rhetorical question. At this point, we don't know what the this is, but they knew, obviously, right? He goes on to say, tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children and their children another generation. So again, the Jewish oral tradition pretty much is as these things happen, you talk about it, you talk about it, you talk about it, talk about it, right? If you go back and look at at Genesis and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, it talks about um, telling your children. And when your children ask, this is what you say. There's a lot of that in there. So here's what the this is. Look at verse 4. When the chewing locust left, obviously that means the chewing locust had been there. The swarming locust has eaten. And what the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has left. I didn't know there were that many kinds of locusts, locust is just like an oversized grasshopper, right? There's some thought, if you're not really into studying bugs, but if you study locusts, in their lives, they go through a series of stages. And there's some thought that these different kind of locusts that he's talking about are those different stages. I don't know if that's true or not. I've just read that in some books about locusts. So again, he doesn't mention Assyria. So this is not crisis A he's talking about. He doesn't mention crisis B. He doesn't mention crisis C. Those are the ones we've talked about, right? This is like crisis L. This is where the locusts have come in. C is Cyrus. And in some respects, Christ. A lot of the prophecy about Cyrus also is a foreshadow of Christ. But this is L. This is locust. Okay. Now, as good Christians and good Baptists, we tend to spiritualize everything. So I don't want you to spiritualize this yet. This is a physical problem that's going on here. Okay. Some people have said, well, he's talking about Assyria, right? Because they came in and destroyed everything. Well, if you look in Joel chapter 2, verse 4, it says their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like swift steeds, so they run. The Assyrians didn't look like horses. They were riding horses. He said they run like mighty men. Well, they were mighty. The Assyrians were mighty men. He said they climb walls like men of war. Everyone marches in formation. They do not break ranks. They do not push one another. Each one marches in its own column. Though they lunge between weapons, they are not cut down. They run to and fro in the city. They run on the walls. They climb into houses. They enter at the windows like thieves. Did the Assyrians or the Babylonians, either one, enter like thieves? No, they came in swinging swords. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the great army of God, bugs. locusts. Literally, this is locusts. This is not an analogy of something. These are locusts. And if you want to know why I called it the army of God, that's what God called them. In Joel chapter 2, verse 11, it says the Lord gives voice before his army. And down in verse 25 of chapter 2, he says, so I will restore to you the years that the swarming locusts have eaten, the crawling locusts, the consuming locusts, the chewing locusts, my great army that I sent among you. Okay. So the Assyrians did not do things like men. They were men. Okay. So again, this is not some kind of analogy we're talking about with the Assyrian crisis. This is something else that's going on. Okay. Let's go back to chapter 1. Chapter 1, verses 17 through 20. The seed shrivels under the clods. Storehouses are in shambles. Barns are broken down, for the grain has withered. How the animals groan. The herds of cattle are restless because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep suffer punishment. O Lord, to you I cry out, for fire has devoured the open pastures, and a flame has burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field also cry out to you, for the water brooks have dried up, and the fire has devoured the open pasture. Okay. So not only did the locusts eat everything, but after the locusts left and they went to plant the crop the next year, there's a drought, and everything dries out, and then you have a lightning strike or something happens, and then you have a fire that runs. The same stuff that goes into California at least once a year, right? Things dry out, and somebody throws a cigarette out a window, or there's a lightning strike, and everything burns up. Okay, the same thing that they're suffering here. Okay. Part of this is also, you got to remember that the seed I'm going to plant next year, where does that come from? It comes from the crop of this year. So if the locusts ate everything this year, there's not a whole lot put in the ground for next year. Okay, you have to kind of build the recovery out of that. Well, now if next year there's a drought, now we're really in trouble, because what seed we did have, we planted is gone. Okay. If this happens to the people of God, what's the implication of this?
Punishment for your sins or something?
I'm sorry?
Punishment for your sins?
It's some kind of chastisement. Yeah. Yeah. Now, again, this is a physical problem, but it affects the spiritual, right? If you look in chapter 1, verse 9, it says the grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priest moan who minister to the Lord. This is one of those statements that sounds like they're still practicing Judaism the way they're supposed to be doing it, right? The grain offerings and the drink offerings are just part of the I don't like the word ritual, but part of the ritual that they do. But they don't have any grain to bring in, right? We talked about the feast of first harvest, first fruits. Well, there's not any fruit. There's not any harvest. So I have nothing to bring. I can't do a grain offering. Okay. How am I going to have a sheep, a lamb without blemish when there's no food, there's no water, right? There's nothing to take to the temple as an offering to the Lord. Joel chapter 1, verse 11 says, be ashamed, you farmers, wail, you vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. Verse 13, it says, for the grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of God. Now, part of this thing is also, think about the priest for a minute. How did the, priest get paid? Again, you go back to Leviticus. Sure, it's a book you all love to read. Go back to Leviticus and look at that. God is crystal clear about when you bring an offering, whether it's a sin offering or this offering or that offering, this is what happens to it. This is what the priest does with it. Some offerings are completely offered on the altar and burned up, but the majority of the offerings, the priest gets a part of. Grain offerings in particular, you bring the grain offering, the priest takes a handful out of the offering and throws it on the altar. And he gets to keep the rest of it. Okay. But nobody's bringing offerings because they've got nothing to bring. So what do the priests do? You know, they're starving like everybody else, right? Verse 16 says, is not the food cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness from the house of God. So there's no harvest, there's no food, there's nothing to take as an offering. Okay. Now, again, from a physical perspective, that's going to affect everybody. It's going to affect the priest. It affects all the people. But in a spiritual sense, again, I don't want to spiritualize this quite yet, but from a spiritual sense, I can't really worship God because I can't bring the offerings, right? Because that's what the law said, to worship God, you do these things. And I can't do that anymore because I've got nothing to bring. Verse 15 says, alas for the day of the Lord is at hand, it shall come as destruction from the Almighty. So again, Joel is very clear. This is happening. This comes from God. This isn't some fluke accident. This comes from God. Now he uses the phrase here, the day of the Lord. Now, normally, when we say the day of the Lord, we're talking about end times. But what happens in the end times? This, what we're talking about here, times a million type of thing, right? So it's, again, a bit of a foreshadow of what's going to happen in the true end times, the true day of the Lord. But the day of the Lord is a day of, it basically means the day of judgment, right? And so these folks are being judged, right? I still don't want to I still don't want to go down the spiritual road with this yet. I want to stay on the physical side of this. Joel is talking about food and water and physical things. Now, make no mistake, if your physical world is upside down, you don't have food to eat, does that affect your spiritual world? Yeah. Now, for some of us, it drives us closer to the Lord. And for some of us, it's like, how could he abandon me like this? And people have a tendency to walk away from God. Okay. So if we talk about again, I can't really talk about the historical background because we don't really know the historical background of this. I made a couple of guesses, but again, I'll repeat, those are opinion and guesses. We don't know, right? But we can talk about the theme, and we can talk about the plan. Okay. The theme, let's look at this. Look at Joel chapter 2, verse 14. Joel writes, who knows if he will turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. Verse 26, he says, you shall eat in plenty and be satisfied and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be put to shame. Okay. So God's answer to this material lack, is really the theme of this, or you could say his method of providing for his people. What do we do when we're on the verge of financial collapse. Now, Liz and I have been in that spot a couple of times. Okay. Literally not knowing where a meal was going to come from. Right. Um, Back at our old house, not actually our old house, not the one we were just in, but the one before that. A couple of times we would come home from somewhere and there were bags of groceries sitting at the front door. Okay. Our church paid our house note 2 or 3 months because we didn't have the money to pay the house note. Yeah, they really, the Lord really took care of us through our church and our Christian friends. When we're on that verge of collapse, of financial collapse, material collapse, what do? I said a minute ago, some people say, well, God's abandoned me. I don't want anything to do with him. Some of us turn closer to God, right? And Joel was saying, we'll be talking about the plan here in just a minute, but Joel was saying all this is going on, but, right, here's the result of that, okay? So let's look at the plan real quick. There's not really so much a plan as Joel. Look at Isaiah and well, he's got this section and this section and this section. And even within this section, there are sections and all that. Joel's not really like that. Joel was kind of like one thought that runs through the whole thing. There's no real breaks. There's no real divisions. The thought flows really without interruption. Now, there's a couple of shifts that go on, okay? But it doesn't quite break the thought pattern. So let's kind of go through that a little bit. And this will be it for the day. Joel chapter 1, verse 2. Hear this, you elders, and give ear, you inhabitants. Verse 5, awake, you drunkards, and weep, and wail, you drinkers of wine. Verse 8, lament like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. This cry and lament like you were betrothed to the love of your life and he died. Okay. 11, be ashamed, you farmers. Wail, you vine dressers. 13, gird yourself and lament, you priests. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Chapter 2, verse 1, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. These are imperatives. They are commands to do something. Okay. Be ashamed, be awake, gird yourself, blow the trumpet. Okay. And that shifts when we get to chapter 2, verse 12. And it starts out with, now, therefore, right? There's still some instruction here. It says, now, therefore, says the Lord, turn to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. See, something shifted here. This is what I was talking about earlier. When you are facing financial distress, material distress, turn to the Lord with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Okay. Verse 18 says, then the Lord will be jealous for his land and pity his people. Okay. I talked earlier about when this starts to happen, some people walk away from God and some people turn toward God. This is talking about the people who respond correctly, who turn and walk closer to God. There are 3 steps here. I'm not, again, they're not really divisions or anything, but there are 3 shifts that go on here. The first one is all the imperatives. So in chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2, verse 11, you have all these imperatives. Wake up, lament, wail. Then if you do this and this and this, then God will do this and this. And that starts in verse 12 of chapter 2. Okay. And it runs through chapter 2, verse 27. Okay. If you respond to God's chastening correctly, then God will relent and he'll do the things that we just described. Then we get to verse 28 of chapter 2, and this runs through the rest of the book, a little bit through chapter 2 and then chapter 3. Chapter 2, verse 28 has this. This may be the only verse in Joel you've ever heard. And it shall come to pass afterwards that I will pour out my spirit on all your flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Okay, now that again is an end time prophecy. Okay, but he's saying when my chastisement comes on you, if you accept it and respond to it properly, then I will meet your physical needs and your spiritual needs. Okay. There'll be food and there'll be drink. But again, when you get to the kind of the tail end of this, starting in chapter 2, verse 28, you start to see spiritual prophecies, right? So when you go through tough times, especially if it appears to be, sometimes it can be a chastening of the Lord. Sometimes it's not, doesn't necessarily have to be a chastening, a chastisement. It can be a test. Okay. Like all the stuff that happened to Job, right? That wasn't chastisement. It wasn't really even so much a test as it was a demonstration with Job. But I think probably all of us, God will test sometimes to see how we're going to respond. And sometimes he gives us good things to see how we respond to that. And sometimes he doesn't give us good things. He may allow bad things to happen to us, again, as a test for us. Like I said, the stuff that Liz and I went through, I don't think that was chastisement. I really don't. I think it was more of a test of us to see how we would respond to things. But not only how we responded to it, but as I said earlier, how people around us, the Christians around us, responded to it. Right? We were seeking the face of the Lord and praying and trying to figure out what to do. But our church and our church friends, Christian friends, were the ones that really rallied to that and provided us against money. And our church had a rule: they wouldn't give you money. If you went into our church, walking off the street and said, "I'm really in a bad spot. I can't pay my electricity bill. I need $100." They wouldn't give you $100. They would ask for your electricity bill and they'd pay it, but they wouldn't give you money. And they did the same thing with me. They didn't give me money. They asked, "How can we pay your house bill?" And I certainly helped them with that. But I was talking to the church manager about that one day, and he said, "Well, you wouldn't believe the stuff that comes in here, He said, it's always the wife that comes in. And he said, I always ask, where's your husband? And they usually say he's out in the car. And he said, my response is, okay, go get him, tell him to come in and ask. And they leave and never come back because the husband won't come in and ask. You know, it's just stuff like that. But again, he said, when they just come in and ask for money, I don't know what they're going to do. We don't know what they're going to do with the money. If they have a need, we want to help them, but I'm not just going to give them money to go do whatever, they want to do with it. Excuse me. It was really interesting being on the staff there and kind of seeing the inside of some of the stuff that went on in the church as far as how they ministered and why they did things certain ways, because it would have not never occurred to me. It would never occur to me to send Liz in and ask for something with me sitting in the car, that, and if it occurred to me, she'd slap it out on me. So it wouldn't have ever happened. Um, but apparently that's, I guess they feel like, number one, they're more likely to give money to a woman than to a guy. Number one. Number two, get that pride thing. I don't want to be the one that have to go in and beg. Um, Asking for help is something we all have to do at different points. It may be financial help. It may be something else, you know. Um, excuse me, but that's just something that it just goes with life. There are bumps and things that happen in life. Some of them are meaningful. Some of them are not meaningful. Some of them are, you know, chastisement. Some of them are tests. But we have to respond to those, and we need to respond to them in the right way. And that's really what the book of Joel is about. Okay. Um, in the hang on a minute. I think if I could find this real quick for us. Give me half a minute. Yeah, see, that's my problem. I'm not on my, I'm on my computer, not on my my iPad. I was thinking it was on my iPad. Don't always have the same tools available to me. One of the online tools that is free to get to is called Blue Letter Bible. There is an app version of it, but you also can go online and look. And actually, if you go online and look, it has a lot of tools. The app version doesn't really have the tools. So it's a little bit different when you try to look at it. But if you look at chapter 3 of Joel, we're gonna look at this in some detail next week. But chapter 3, verse 1 of Joel says, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem." Again, that's one of the reasons why I feel like he's talking to the southern kingdom. He said, "I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into my judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations." Now, at this point in time, has Israel been scattered? No, they haven't. Pretty much no matter where on that timeline you want to put Joel, Israel and Judah are both still there. Okay. They have cast lots for my people. They have given a boy as payment for a harlot and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. And this is where he gets in talking about Sidon and Tyre and Philistia. Philistia is where the Philistines lived over. Actually, it's pretty much Gaza is where that is. He says, "Indeed, what have you to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon and the coast of Philistia?" will you retaliate against me? But if you retaliate against me, swiftly and speedily, I will return your retaliation upon your own head. Because you have taken my silver, my gold, and carried into your temple my prized possessions. Again, the prized possessions of God, besides his people, are the items that he had in the temple. Okay. And although Tyre, Sidon, and Philistia had raided and killed the Jews, nobody had ever violated the temple at this point. That didn't happen. First time that happened was when Babylon came in. Okay. He just goes on and on and on. Another verse, chapter 3, verse 10, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong. Okay. So he goes on in chapter 3, again, more with an end time prophecy than what's going to happen in the next week or two type of a thing. And prophets, as we've talked many times, um, when they give a prophecy, they're talking to the immediate needs of the people, but always mixed in there, you see futuristic prophecies, end time prophecies, things like that. If you look down in verse 19, it says, Egypt will be a desolation and Edom a desolate wilderness because of the violence against the people of Judah, for they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah will abide forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. For I will acquit them of the guilt of bloodshed, whom I had not acquitted, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So again, that's a prophecy of the end time. Okay. If you look at what's going on over there now, there's certainly not the peace that the prophets talk about, right? Missiles flying, all kind of stuff going on, bombs falling. Most of them are not falling in Israel or falling other places, but there's still this war that's going on, and the peace, the beating of your swords into plowshares and things like that. Now the verse 10 in chapter 3 of Joel is the opposite of what we have seen in some other ones, where it says, the lamb and the lion shall lay down together, and you'll turn your swords into plowshares, your spears into pruning hooks. In Joel chapter 3, verse 10, it's the other way. He says, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. So, at that point, he's not talking about the peace that comes. He's talking about the battle that happens before that. What we'll call the first and second battles of Armageddon. That's what he's talking about here. So there's that war that goes on. That's not what we're seeing today. It may be prelude to that, but that's not what we're seeing today. This is not on a par with the battles of Armageddon. And they happen after the tribulation. We're certainly not in the tribulation yet because we're still here. But it's again, the prophecy of the war that is going to come through before we finally get to the actual millennial period and the post-millennial period. A lot of people don't, we haven't talked about this, but a lot of people, when we talk about the tribulation period, I think we talked about this. There are pre-tribulation folks, which is probably most of us. We think that the rapture happens prior to the tribulation period. There are post-tribulation people who think we go through the tribulation and Christ comes back at the end of that. And then there are some that are called mid-tribbers, and they think we go through the first half and then Christ comes and has the rapture before the second half, before the great tribulation starts. When you talk about the millennial period, you have premillennialists and you have post-millennialists, and then you have a group called amillennialists. We are, as a group, we are pre-millennial, okay, which means that the true second coming of Christ happens prior to the millennial period. Okay, not the rapture, but the second coming. The post-millennialists believe it is up to us as the church to bring about the millennial age. I'm like, good luck with that. And that Christ comes back after we've established 1,000 years of peace here on earth. And then you have the amillennialists who just think, well, that's just, there's not really a millennial period. They just kind of discard the whole thing. So as we've studied the prophets, we see the different prophecies in the scriptures. Even when you go back to look when we studied the feast, the timeline of the Bible is to me, and I hope to you, is very clear in the order of things that happen toward the end. There is the rapture, where the church is taken up. There's the millennial period. There's the second coming of Christ, the Lamb's feast, wedding feast. Then the millennial period, and then the end of time. That doesn't mean we all go away. That just means time just stops, right? Time doesn't exist at that point. There's no yesterday, tomorrow, or any of that kind of stuff. You don't have to hurry to get anything done. But if you look at the feast and you look at the prophets and stuff like that, that's very clear that stuff is laid out in that order. Okay. And again, for the post-millennialists, I think good luck trying to establish 1,000 years of peace here on this earth without the direct intervention of God, because it's not going to happen. Not going to happen, folks. So keep praying for the folks in the Middle East. Pray for our leaders as well. The Bible tells us very clearly to do that. And just be ready.